All right. Well, got to live up to that intro. That was pretty. It was my first experience with that. I'm feeling pretty. Stakes are pretty high here. Okay, so welcome to the "So You Want to Work on Urbit" panel for Urbit Developer Week. Um, what we're gonna do is we're going to spend a little bit of time talking with some members of the ecosystem here, who are representatives of various companies and some of the core developers, kind of give people an idea of what it takes to work on Urbit, what it takes to have a job working on Urbit full time, and kind of how we all got in the positions that we're in. Give a little bit of open the kimono a little bit. Is that lewd? I don't know, whatever. But that's what we're gonna basically show a little bit about how the sausage is made. I'm mixing metaphors. So first, let me go ahead and introduce everybody here. And then I have a few questions prepared. I'm going to go through these panelists. I'm going to ask them questions, and you guys just go ahead and feel free to chime in, to disagree, to fight if you guys are physically proximal. And then at the end, my lovely assistant Gordon, who's off screen somewhere over here, is going to collect questions from the chat and kind of only the finest questions will be posed to our group of experts here. So why don't we go ahead and just introduce some of these guys. So first we have Ted Blackman, Rob Nice Rickfer, an old head, not an old Urbit head, let's say. He's been around maybe as long as probably we've been around about the same amount of time. So
about the same amount of time.
About the same amount of time.
I think I met you at
meetup.
Urbit meetup in 2017. Yeah,
absolutely. And then so he's currently the CTO at the foundation. He was one of the core developers at Tlon. He recently switched over. He just did a lot of work on the roadmap for the project. So everybody who hasn't seen it, roadmap.urbit.org, roadmap.urbit.org, roadmap.urbit.org. Go check it out. Next we have BitMep Fast Wine, one William Ball, who is the Don, the head cheese, the head honcho at Assembly Capital. I was like, I was just gonna I realized I didn't know the exact title, so I'm just gonna go for it. But he and Assembly Capital has been since as long as I've been around, one of the biggest investors in the Urbit space, in both in Tlon, in address space, and a lot of the other companies that are coming up. So they've really done they're basically the original VC investor group around the ecosystem. So he's got a lot of experience, seen a lot of stuff. Next up, we have Lomder Librun, who is Trent, the CEO and founder of Holium. So Holium, for those of you who are under a rock, is working on basically a collaborative OS for DAOs and various internet communities that really takes a lot of the kind of UX benefits that we've talked about Urbit for a long time and really tries to bring them to light, and I think has been really successful. He's going to release Realm coming up the 12th of December. So lots of cool stuff there, but has a lot to say. Next up, we have Rabsef Bikram, who is what's your position at Quartus? Head honcho?
Yeah.
Major domo?
Grand potentate.
Grand potentate. That's good. Of Quartus. Quartus is I would say the premier dev shop working in the Urbit space. So they've done a lot of back-end work, front-end work, all kinds of different stuff. So he and a couple other guys, they've been working together and they've been hooning hard. He also has a very unique background, which maybe he'll get into a little bit later.
You talking about the cat?
I was being metaphorical. I meant your life background, sir. And then finally, we have Famhut Woolpikes. I'm sorry. Luke Stiles, who's currently on location in South Africa. He is are you VP engineering at Tlon? Is that right?
I am.
He is. He's also, but he's actually, represents, I would say, I don't want to call you the Sheryl Sandberg, but he's like one of the grown-ups that's helping Urbit become real. being real boys. So it's like he's kind of like he works at Tlon now, but he's helping level up this entire space, and and I think a lot of the work you've done at Tlon in terms of like the engineering discipline has been really great to see. So he also has a lot of experience in other domains, hiring engineers, hiring people in general. So welcome to all of you. Really happy to have you here. All right, so Luke, since I just fumbled your introduction, I'm going to go ahead and give you the first meatball question here. So you could also talk a little bit about your background pre-Tlon, but you've worked on a lot of different stuff, and I'm kind of interested to know, in your experience, both in the Urbit space and out of the Urbit space, what are kind of the failure stories you've seen? What are in terms of hiring mishaps, right? What have you noticed as things have gone wrong, things haven't suboptimally, as people sometimes euphemistically say? In your experience, what have you seen? And then a little bit honed down on Urbit in particular, if you've seen people not work out, things not work out, what has been and you can anonymize it as much as you see fit. Go ahead.
Sure. I think, listen, smart people do good work, but that's sort of a necessary but not sufficient condition. And there is this, I think at Urbit, what I've seen is Ted, I think I got this one from him. He introduced me squarely, or pushed into daily use, the term galaxy brain in my vocabulary. And so I think Urbit invites galaxy brainness. However, you have to use that approach with care. And so I think there's a lot of really ordinary things that we can do really well that will make Urbit incredibly excellent. And that it itself is this galaxy brain container. And so it attracts people who have that impulse. And it's not bad or wrong or incorrect. It just needs to be applied judiciously. And so in terms of people getting work done, we have people actively doing research, but even there, I recently drafted a researcher job description just so that we could sort of say, like, hey, we know that this is what good looks like. And I think just more generally, it's important to have agreement about what good looks like, because there are people in the Urbit community that have sort of incredible drive, incredible ownership that goes vastly beyond their years, and are going to kind of at some point burn out if they don't believe that others are meeting the standard that they're setting. And so sometimes and like sort of like a general HR thing is, you want to reward high performers and make sure that they're doing what they want to do as well as they can. But we tend to spend most of our time on people who need help. So I think, if I've learned anything in life, it's like, I worked for a consultancy for a little while that had an up and out policy, and it's kind of gnarly, but shit, they work hard and they're smart people.
Yeah. That's right. So you think that in terms of, one thing that I've noticed, especially when you get into these things with Urbit, is like, there are these questions that can become research questions. And it's like the line between, especially core work, architectural work, it's sort of like they fade into, it's not a clear distinction, right? It's like maybe somewhere else you have someone who just writes PHP and someone else who is in the laboratory. But here we end up kind of mixing them together. And do you think that makes it harder to kind of like enforce or just keep rein on the galaxy brain?
I don't think it has to. Like, I think you create a space for that, and it's just about being clear when you're entering and exiting that space. And it's very hard. Like, I worked at Amazon for a little bit, and one of the hardest things was like taking something out of the lab and into the world. And like when something was like, yeah, that's good, we're going to do that, it was like, you lost anyone who was working on that to that project until that thing was up and running. And so there's an aspect of that too, which I actually feel pretty strongly about. That is, ideas are not enough. Like, you have to get this thing to people. Otherwise, like, go to grad school, which is also an awesome place,
Yeah.
And maybe we should figure out how to sponsor PhDs. Like I am 100% serious when I say that. I'm 100% serious.
It's
Oh,
like the
there's
stud
a
farm.
guy who's about to do. There's a guy who's about to do a master's thesis on Urbit.
Which
Really?
is
It's
yeah,
happening. Yeah.
and like what maybe there's PL people that we can like, and they want to get a grant. We can give them a grant. I don't know.
Yeah. I think UF will end up probably working with that guy, giving him a grant. We'll see. I mean, we'll
The
talk.
endowed chair, the Ted Blackman endowed chair of programming languages. I love it.
So just in closing, one thing, like there's a thought that's been circulating around that I'm gonna attribute to Philip, but it may have come from somewhere else. That like the only way that Urbit fails if we don't build it fast enough. And so when we get distracted in these different directions, that's something that happens, right? And so we need to sort of be self-aware and hold each other accountable, make sure we're not getting in the way of somebody who's trying to get this thing going, even if that work is itself incredibly important. You know what I mean?
Yeah. No, absolutely. The rest of you guys, have you seen? Have you had people that haven't worked out, or even in the Urbit context or non-Urbit context? What are kind of the failure modes you guys have seen?
Well,
Add to
I can jump in on this. I think to Luke's point, there's like I used to work in the GE Innovation Center years ago, and we had this sort of thing where we had these people on projects that were more so focused on the R&D side of things. And what we sort of realized was that you really just had to distill information from the R&D folks and translate that to the product team. Because we used to have people that were full R&D on the product team, and it just never, they were like two different disciplines almost. So to that point, I think it's good to sort of if you're focused on product, you just focus on product. And so for me, it's really the attention to detail that we look for. And there have been people in the past, in previous companies as well, where you sort of give them the spec, you give them the requirements, you give them a design, and they don't happen to sort of map to that. And it's sort of then there's this huge iteration cycle of here, look at this, it's the spacing's this, or it should look like that, or here's what the usability angle should be here. Whereas people that can sort of intuit those things, to me, are hugely valuable, especially at a small startup stage, or small company stage. So that would be the sort of feedback or thoughts on that from me.
Yeah. I mean, I think what's one interesting thing is that, like you said, partitioning those mindsets, if you're going to be just insane pixel product mindset, you being in the same room as Galaxy Brain multi-year, it's going to have maybe a negative effect on both of you, right? And so maybe one of the good things about having the ecosystem be kind of more spread out is you can have these organizations kind of optimize for these different mindsets, so we're not all jammed together, right? I mean, that's what I see as maybe a positive.
I disagree. I think we're too small to specialize at this time. I think we got room for maybe one or two people who can be in that mode. But I think anyway, I think we've burned down the majority of the technical risk, and we got to get.
So you think there's a benefit to people with these different mindsets being together? Is that basically what you're saying?
I do. Yeah, I do. The handoff isn't always smooth, but that's how this stuff gets done. Otherwise, off-ramping ideas into commercialization when they've been hermetic up until that point is incredibly hard. It's people make huge amounts of money on this, IP transfer stuff out of universities into private industry. That's a great example. What Trent was describing of you've got these people and they've got these really good ideas. I sold so many digital innovation labs at previous jobs. Nothing ever happened out of those places unless they somehow struck gold, but they were just a place where ideas went to die.
Yeah. I mean, that's kind of my experience. I worked at a similar thing, kind of trying to productize research in the past. I didn't think that we all kind of ended up working in similar environments, but there is definitely that transfer, that jump very rarely works well. And so you're right that there is some benefit maybe to having like that implicit knowledge be more connected. It's just like all idea transfer. There's all this implicit stuff. Okay, great. Well, I'm going to move on to the next question just to make sure we cover everything here. But thanks a lot, Luke and Trent. Trent, actually, I'm just going to pick on you because you were the last talk here. So one thing, actually, and we had some people ask us a lot of times, is about non-technical jobs, right? Non-technical is just a huge actual negative definition, right? It's everything that's not technical, right? So, but I was kind of wondering from your perspective, and I mean, like, in case people aren't familiar, a lot of what Holium does is very, like I said, very product focused, very design focused. What are the most applicable non-technical areas of expertise and experience you like to see, either hiring that you've done here or in other environments, and specifically related to Urbit though, like in terms of when you're coming to work on an Urbit project, what other like non-Hoon, let's just be really clear, like non-Hoon, non-Ver, non-Urbit skills do you like to see and you've seen be successful?
Yeah, I mean, I think with like the non-technical side of things, really, you know, at Holium, we're fairly technical. We're focused on the product side for sure, but in terms of like non-technical roles that we're hiring for, there's a handful, but I would say generally when it comes to hiring, especially at the smaller scale that we're hiring at, with Holium being a smaller company, you just have to find people that are able to fill in the gaps. At this, so for us, like, we have people working on, music and branding and things like that. And in all those cases, like the thing that, I always try to look for is people that can intuit the sort of gray areas between everything. Because again, like there's a huge amount of iteration that has to be put in and process put in to sort of like define like every single detail. So if you can have someone who can fill in the gaps, and you say you design state A and design state B, and then that person can infer what state C should be, then in that case, like those sorts of people are, or I don't know what skill set that would be, just sort of like intuition.
I mean, intuition, basically. Yeah. I mean, because it's a flip side of communication is like someone has to be able to like, whatever, hang with what you're saying and get your vision. I mean, that is definitely a skill some people have and some people need to be very walked through, right? Yeah.
So, I mean, to me, like that's really the most important skill set outside of like a technical skill is just sort of that ability. Like we recently hired someone who's like, without even asking, he's gone on and fixed some problems we had in our project structure. It just sort of like were built over time because of the technical debt and like the priorities never circle back around. But also this sort of like ability to find a problem and just fix it without being told is another important thing at this, in a startup. So like that's a very huge skill set. It's just being able to like solve problems when you see them as well. So yeah, I would say that's another one. These are like the soft skills, I suppose.
Yeah. Eric, what kind of non-technical skills have you found to be like contribute to success in the projects you worked on?
I think the most important thing for me on my team is that people give me honest feedback about the ideas that I bring to bear, because I have kind of a strong personality when it comes to new ideas that are brewing in me. And so I'll get very excited about something that I'm thinking about and present it to the team. And the worst thing that could happen is that everyone agrees with me, right? Because then we've done no review of the product. And I've found that sometimes it's more or less challenging to draw out of your colleagues the kind of feedback that you need. Some people are more open to that. I think it might even be just a Midwestern thing. You know what I mean? Like, if you're Midwestern, it's harder to say these kinds of things to people. And Midwestern is a stand-in for many other types of cultures that might have these kinds of values.
Yeah.
But getting past that hurdle is a big thing for me.
So don't be from the Midwest is your highest.
And I'm from Kansas City, so I can say that.
I live in the Midwest now, and I'm not from the Midwest, and people ask me all the time if I'm from New York, just because because that's their like stand-in for like confrontational person,
right. Yeah, they're
so
saying something.
yeah, which is fine. But I totally have been in that position before as someone who also has a loud voice. People who aren't going to give you honest feedback are going to ultimately drag things down. And that's really, really important to see. Ted, what's your perspective on this?
Yeah.
It's like just code,
on what the most important soft skills are?
MSAM and coding.
Is that the question?
MSAM patch. Yeah. What kind of soft skills, what kind of non-technical skills do you think contribute the most, in addition to technical skills, to a successful participant in the Urbit ecosystem or one of these companies?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think one thing is just communication. Like, can you explain yourself? And actually, honesty and communication is quite helpful, right? So that goes for feedback, like what Eric was saying, but also being able to ask for help when you need it is very important, right? And people are coming in here, they're learning a whole new world of computing, and one of the big problems is when people just they don't want to admit that something is difficult or that they're having trouble with it, and so they'll bang their head against it for months, and then sometimes that can be difficult to, it can be hard to help them. And the truth is, like, most people, when they come in, almost everybody actually needs some amount of help, and that's fine, right? But it's better if you can ask for it, and you have to be able to accept it. So that requires it's like a mix of humility and confidence, right? Because you have to have enough humility that you can admit that you don't know something, and then enough confidence that you can ask about it without feeling like an idiot.
Yeah.
So I think that's a big one, especially as people are getting started. Yeah.
Good.
That's what I would say.
Very good. It's funny. I have the exact same experience, and it's like, you notice that finding someone who is a galaxy brain and has that intellectual humility sometimes is like, that's actually, if you find that person, that's a very special kind of person, right? But it's rare, because sometimes people are like, I am, Haskell, God on Earth. I would never ask a question about how to set up my email correctly.
I think it can be trained. That just as a note,
Shocking.
I get code reviews from some people that I trust in the community, and I have trouble taking feedback, right? Like, that's just something about me. It's like gifted child syndrome. I feel like I'm always right. And when I hear feedback where they're like, why didn't you do it this way? I'm like, well, that's stupid, right? But I have to spend 15 to 20 minutes after getting that kind of feedback processing it and going, okay, I'm going to do it. And yeah, it means I have to rewrite something, and you're just going to swallow that pride. And that can be trained. So if you feel like you're going to have that initial response, think about how it might augment your life to like modify that response.
Yeah, no, I agree. You can get better at it, but it's not static. But I have the same thing where it's like, I get feedback, and this is how you know you have a good boss, in my opinion. You get feedback, and you're like, man, fuck that guy. And then like 5 minutes later, you're like, he's right. And it's like, you have a good boss, that's like the definition to me, because he told you you needed to hear. Okay, good. So now, Ted, just to make this more technical, I'd like to know from your perspective. So, Urbit is it's actually very old, but like, in terms of people knowing Hoon, knowing Knock, we're kind of early stages. And so that means a lot of people, with a few, increasing exceptions, have technical experience outside of Urbit. They've already been a programmer. They've already designed software, whatever. And so, in your opinion, what have you found to be the most sort of transferable outside technical skills, Terran technical skills, we might say, like, and I'd be interested to know just kind of what you've seen be successful in terms of people coming into the project.
Yeah. It's interestingly difficult to find a coherent pattern among those things, because people have come in from such a wide variety of different backgrounds. Some people come in, they've never programmed before. Other people, they're coming in from very large companies, 10 years of experience, master's degrees. even one guy with a PhD. But I would say that general systems thinking is the most transferable skill, because that, like Urbit is very much a systems project, with the core in particular, but even a number of what we think of as apps are really systems programming. Like Holium's Realm, that's systems programming, right? They're building an environment for front end. Oakbar, they're building an environment for contract execution, right? So actually, a lot of what we think of as user space or app dev on Urbit is still systems programming. So the systems thinking is still very important. And systems thinking, I don't know exactly how to define it, but it's something like, you're used to writing code that runs other code, or code that gets used by a lot of other different things, right? Something that's a foundational part of a bigger system. And when you're building that kind of thing, it's very different from building an application. You have to think about it in a very different way. And so while Urbit sort of proposes and executes on several novel ways of doing systems programming, the overall mindset is still like very much in that sort of like in that realm, right? Like it's not that different from for example, at my previous job before I worked on Urbit, one of the things I built was a microcontroller communication protocol, right? And that got used by several different, used in several different ways, and it sort of, the applications of it evolved over time. But I had to write that in a way that it worked over and over again, millions and millions of times, never broke, right? And so that means in order to write something like that, it has to be really dumb, right? It has to be sort of simple, very easy to reason about, and that's really how we have to write everything in Urbit, right? And so this is the big way to sort of counteract the galaxy brain tendency that I think we all have. Our predisposition toward architectural astronautics has to be tempered by knowing that this thing actually has to work completely. And so that means that you have to be able to, it has to not be at the edge of what you understand. It has to be like well within what you can understand and reason about, and prove to yourself and prove to your colleagues that it's correct.
Yeah, that's really good. I mean, it's funny because I think about that a lot. Like and when I'm feeling ornery and I see people, I mean, you see it less so now, but you'd see people kind of have speculative new functional OSs that they'd write a few Medium posts about and they'd abandon, right? And it's always like that, but I've always been like, yeah, but our shit runs, and it's and that's really what defines Urbit, is that it fucking runs, right? It's a space age crazy idea, but it actually works. And that to me has always been the strength of it, is the fusion of that kind of like speculative systems thinking and the practicality of like, we got to ship updates. We have people that use this thing. We have to ship OTA updates that work. And that's like a huge requirement that we somewhat put on ourselves, but it has kept this whole thing, I think, moving in the right direction. So I think that's really, really good. In terms of the systems thinking though, do you have any ideas about how to like develop that? Like if you're just some sort of, I don't know, you're a web shit and you're like, I want to become a systems thinker, is like, how do you go about doing that?
You have to practice it like anything else. All right, so you have to start trying to build modules that get reused.
Deploy your whole app, work up and down and across the stack. Imagine 1 million users. If you're doing web stuff, like web stuff is the original distributed systems. There's a lot of knowledge in there. Yeah.
So just take it seriously.
Don't get stuck.
Is that the idea? I think it's probably true.
No tool chain. Well, hey.
And I would say in particular, try to move down the stack, because a lot of people, when they first start programming, myself included, start near the top. You start building some application. Yeah. And then, so if you try to build something that's more like a library or framework or a protocol, or a compiler or something like that, right? So build something that supports many applications, right? After you've gotten used to working on applications.
Yeah.
I'm going to call out that I think that the thing that you're calling systems thinking is the same thing as the communication patterns that we were discussing earlier of being able to, I think, Wamder, you were talking about it most specifically, being able to kind of intuit from what somebody else is saying in their context, how that should be interpreted in your context. That's kind of the same thing as systems thinking in the sense that there are many different applications that might come together, or many different parts of the subordinate system, and thinking about how those interface and how air might be communicating about something in a way that you need to handle in a different context in Gaul and interpret in a different way when you're passing it back to something else or whatever. That's all just communications, for me at least. And I feel like the way that I was able to
brought it
get
all
into
together, folks.
I think that I've said this many times before, and I'll just say that Urbit was an easy way of getting into that conversation about computing, like the systems thinking about computing, because it reduced the level of complexity that I saw in the prior stack. And so engaging in that conversation is the way to move forward.
I would say almost all of my experience in systems programming has been working in Urbit, and it's really how I've learned to think about it. I'd done some of it before here and there. Not just the microcontroller thing, a few other projects, but it was still mostly application level. And I think actually Urbit is a much easier way to get into systems programming than almost anything else.
Yeah.
We've got a whole kernel and 30,000 lines of code, right? With
I was going to say
kernel modules, right? And so
yeah,
it's not that much code, right? It's just you can spend a little while and read it, and then go and read it again. And, you actually have time to do this because there's so little of it. So, and the general, the complexity of the system is low enough that you can hold most of it in your head. And then the parts of it that you can't hold in your head are well sequestered off behind some boundary, right? Like, there are details of how DIL, the terminal vein, works that I don't know. But I know that it's not a problem that I don't know how those things work, because that's well, sheltered from the rest of the system, right? That's like, there's a very strong abstraction boundary between DIL and everything else. And so, and that's just generally true, right? So we don't have that many abstractions, but when we do, they're very strong boundaries. The abstractions essentially don't leak. This is highly debatable whether they leak at all. You can find little ways in which maybe they do, but in general, you can often say, well, the ways in which they leak are, law of large numbers. There's such a small probability that's like, yeah, okay, if you get hit by a cosmic ray, they leak, but otherwise they don't. Then treat that as if they don't leak, right? So there's we have much stronger abstractions in Urbit, and then because of that, you end up with a system whose overall dimensionality is much lower than in a typical system that does something similar. I mean, so you can really learn it, and then you can learn how these different pieces communicate, as Eric is saying.
Yeah, I think that you're definitely. I mean, that's like, of course, the cute answer, right? Is like that the way to learn systems thinking is just to develop on Urbit. Right? It's like, which I think is better. That is
true, though. I mean,
true. I mean, I think that when I started working on Urbit, like I didn't know anything about operating systems, and at that level, right? I like wrote basically natural language processing, shit applications for different text mining things, data mining. But like through working at Urbit, I was like, at the end, I was like, oh, I actually do understand an operating system because I've just been tinkering with this operating system. And it's really the fact that it's the product, it is so simple, so mechanically simple. It does give you an insight into this stuff that I think would be hard to gain. Like the only way to gain it otherwise, I think, would be just a lot of kind of trial and error and doing a whole bunch of other wacky shit. I mean, it really is kind of like a master class, or just, I don't even know what the right. It's like an etude, right? It's like a simple thing that demonstrates something, and so it's like you can learn it by messing with it. So that's
a good way to think about it.
an etude is a study in for those of you listeners at home that don't know that, is an etude is like a simple, usually musical exercise that demonstrates or teaches something. It's used for practicing things, but there's many famous ones. And so for those of you in the chat that are asking questions, we're going to come back to questions at the end for the ones that haven't been covered. So I'm not just ignoring those. Let's see. Let's see here. Systems thinking. Bitmap, William. Like I said, you've been funding a lot of companies, and Assembly Capital has been building up internal engineering capacity and been developing radio, what was it called? Not Star Market,
Houston.
Star Swap,
Startup Market,
Startup
and
Market,
Urbit Live.
Urbit Live. So you guys have done, like, you've funded outside stuff, you've done stuff internally, so you've actually probably dealt with a lot of contributors in general. And so my question for you is, basically, in your experience of what you've seen, what kind of a hiring process or a recruitment process do you think is the best? So I'm thinking, like, if we go from do all these, do these whiteboard, do FizzBuzz on a whiteboard on one level, or like, do contract work for a while, instead of, like, what is kind of the hiring process that you've seen have the most success?
Yeah, totally. Well, and just to back up a little bit, like, I think it helps if you want to work on Urbit and you're not, you probably got involved more recently. And so just understanding the kind of the context of, like, for most of Urbit's history, it's largely been an R&D project. And forever it was pretty much just Talon that was building. And like I said, it was mostly R&D. The people that were working there were very high IQ engineers, and then some designers and product people. And it was this kind of esoteric thing that, we weren't attracting a lot of trad business people, TradFi people. Even Luke, who was on here, he very much comes from a business background. And that is part of, like, a shift that's happened over the past year, is not only, like, the network's begun to open up where there's now other companies like Uqbar and Holium and Zorp that are hiring and building, but in general, we're becoming more growth oriented, where we have to grow the network. We have to develop really beautiful product. And so there's just a general shift to, like, before, where it's just like finding really smart people. Now we need, like, people with very specific kind of skill sets. So that's product design, finance, ops, whatever. We have a need for founders and executive leadership. And so that's sort of, where we are. Like, when I wanted something to do and I didn't want to work at Talon, we started Urbit Live. So I became an entrepreneur. And, like, kind of before that, we decided, hey, we're going to build a venture firm around Urbit called Assembly Capital. So I really took, like, kind of a route as being an entrepreneur and creating my own opportunity. And that's certainly, like, available for anybody, but you got to have the right attitude and personality. And, like, Trent's a really good example of someone that came in, wanted to be a founder, and also, like, Trent is a designer. He's a product design guy, and he's also an engineer. And so those soft skill sets really has led him where he's now, in the middle of raising another round and is hiring people. And so I've seen that be very successful. I think Justin Murphy's another example on the non-technical side of, like, hey, here's somebody that's not technical. He, really wants to contribute to the network, and he just starts contributing. And before long, like, he's now helping us, like, kind of on the marketing front. So those are just, like, two examples of what I think is working well in terms of, like, out there, some clear examples. And then honestly, Trent's process, I did this a lot in my own companies, is, like, we'll a lot of times start out with a contract period before moving into full time. And that's because there's, like, certain costs once you bring somebody on full time, like, to, go another direction. And one of the things we see in the network, like, the best founders really, when they see something aren't working, they're making a quick change. And if you work somewhere and it's not working, at the end of the day, like, you don't, long term, that's not what's best for you. It's not what's best for the company. So I like that kind of contract setup. But at the end of the day, like, big companies don't do that. I would assume part of it is just, like, needing to be competitive. You need to give somebody, like, the full-time offer and the benefits. But, like, Urbit really, doesn't have that. There's not a ton of companies that have, like, a lot of benefits and that sort of stuff. It's still more the Wild West. And so I think the contract thing works out fine, especially if you're working for a DAO like Uqbar. That's really the only option.
Yeah. So you think just contract work is the best way to kind of road test everyone, and then move on to full time after that?
It seems to be, because the ecosystem's not super mature, like you're kind of having to wear multiple hats, and like figure out do these personalities work. And ultimately, with one thing I've learned, I've been very humbled hiring engineers. I let Ben, my business partner, hire them because it's hard to really know, how it's going to end up working out. And so, contract seems to be a good route. Trent, would you kind of agree with that?
Yeah, I think for us, like I would say, mostly all the people that we brought on were based on someone who was doing it like a bounty or contract first, and then you could really see how people work. So, and it's good both ways, right? So it's good for the person who's doing the contract because they're getting paid to do something on Urbit, and we're getting a benefit of like getting someone who's contributing part time to like usually it's a project that's not like directly core to what we're doing, but it's something that we need to get done. So it's like we can try them out, they can try us out. If it's all good, then we just give them an offer. And one example of this recently is we hired someone who just reached out through Justin Murphy. Actually, he was like, "Oh, I want to see if Holland was hiring," and Justin forwarded this to me, and I essentially gave him a task and said, "Look, if you can get Ballot working with the Realm theme system without me giving you any more information than that, then we'll pay you essentially $1,000 for doing that, and then we'll if it looks good, we'll hire you." And so that was essentially a thing that this candidate did, and we paid him $1,000, and we brought him on. And so it's something. It's like we didn't have time to go back and do that with Ballot, but by having someone who has initiative, he dove in, figured it out. We merged the PR recently. We haven't pushed it yet, but we probably will soon before 12/12. But that's sort of the way I see. Yeah. Like that's to me is the best kind of way, because also we didn't really give much instruction, so it sort of that intuition and that sort of like the soft skill stuff that I was talking about earlier is really showcased in those moments.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's such a great example, because what I was going to say is that the only argument I think about the contract as interview type trial contract is that there's always overhead on the part of the hire, right? Like any hiring process, there's overhead. And so it's like finding an issue that's really good, that's going to exercise them for the necessary things, that's going to not be a total disaster if they don't deliver. Sometimes that can be kind of difficult to find. And that's why so I understand if you're a big company, why I would just have a machine to do this. Cause I'm like asking all of your managers to always have a few issues that can be, just used for hiring is sometimes difficult. So that's actually a great example to find something like that. And I think also what I was going to say for people maybe who don't know is you've done a lot of work, and I want to give you this compliment to your face. I've said this to other people. I'm going to give it to your face right now. Holium has done a whole bunch of bounties and work with the foundation, and has been able to use a lot of the foundation grant structure to build products for the Realm kind of ecosystem. And that's a very hard thing to do from a managerial perspective, to take kind of a very heterogeneous labor set, meaning like people maybe come in just for a few months, whatever, and have it all gel into one thing, I think is very difficult. So I wanted to give you that. I think you've done a really great job at that. But what I was going to say is that it also feeds into your recruitment pipeline, because you get to see all those people right in action, basically.
Yeah. It's like test driving a car sort of thing. It's like you want to actually see what it's like to work with someone before you actually make the big commitment. Because I think a bad hire is actually detrimental for a startup.
Absolutely.
So that's why to me it's very important to suss out who's good.
Yeah, because it's like a bad hire is lost work of that person, and can also have externalities that drag everything else, down. So it's really important, I think. Ted,
I would say one more thing about the
go for it.
About the grant program. First of all, Urbit Foundation has a grants program. You should check it out on urbit.org/grants. And there we go. And It's been quite successful over the past couple of years, both at getting things developed, but especially at recruiting and training new engineers on both core and app dev. There you have it. There's the link. But it's interesting because I was just talking to a grantee yesterday, and he was saying that it's been really nice for him because he has a full-time job as an engineer, not on Urbit. But that's been great for him because he's been able to work part-time outside of his normal job. He's been able to get to know all the people that he could work with if he decides to come and work full-time. And he knows what the work is like, right? So it's not just a benefit for the company, it's also a big benefit for somebody who wants to sort of dip their toes in the water in a way that doesn't require a lot of commitment. And you don't have to quit your job to do some Urbit work. You can do a little bit on the side, get remunerated, and then see how you like it. Yeah. And then once you've done the work, if you actually get the grant done, then companies know that you have some skills that are likely useful for them.
The grants resume builder is is really the right answer, right? Because then you basically have like a portfolio of grants that you've completed that you can show people if they ask. I mean, like I also want to point out that's like, I mean, as William said, I mean, we 10 years ago, 5 years ago, we knew everybody on the network. There was like you could pay, oh, we need to hire an engineer. It's like I already know every engineer, right? So we're actually just entering this stage where we have to be hiring people that we don't know. And it's like, so I mean, it's been great to see what you guys have been able to do with this new crop of people. And I think the grants program is great for that because that gets you exposure into the people that will be making hiring decisions. So grants is probably the right answer for everybody looking to get involved on a technical level. Grants is the easiest one-word answer. Okay, let's go ahead and move on real quick. Eric, this is a question for you. We talked about non-technical skills, but there's a lot of people that have front-end skills. Actually, probably it's like the one of the biggest pivot points from existing web technology into Urbit, right? Is that all these things we still use React and the normal kind of HTML, JS, CSS stack for a lot of the front ends, and so there's a lot of people with front end skills that we'd like to bring into Urbit, and that's the thing that I think a lot of things could benefit from is that product and UI expertise. So, in your experience, what has been when you bring in someone with front end experience? What has been successful? What hasn't been successful? And what do you look for in a front end developer to work on Urbit projects?
Yeah. So we're kind of actively looking at increasing our ability to do front end work presently, because what I'd like to do is, as people work with Quartus for a longer period of time, get them closer to the Hoon where I think we do our best work as Quartus, which is producing Hoon that does, whatever operation we're trying to get the Hoon to do. To get someone to do the front end work, I think the thing that I'm most looking for is someone who has a strong ability to make a cohesive design decision, because I don't always have strong opinions towards the front end user design. I have strong opinions about the back end, and I need to have other people who have more experience in that area bring that to bear. And this kind of relates back to what I was saying earlier. Please feel free to be hard in your critique with me so that I can understand where we could improve, right? Bring your own ideas to bear here. And so I guess this is must be a self-starter and requires initiative pitch out of every job application you've ever seen. But it is true. And I think this is responsive to some things I've seen floating through chat as well, that it's when we see strong relationships form on Urbit right now, it's not the 5 years ago that you described where everyone knows everyone necessarily. It's because people are showing up and making those connections that those exist. It's not a cabal of people who had a preordinated plan. And the best way to get yourself in front of any one of us, I think, is to show up on the network and start producing. And so for front end work, submitting a PR change to make something better, or presenting your own front end for something and saying, hey, I did a competitive version, this is, I think, better, would be a huge thing. But even just being available to talk. There was somebody on Twitter, AFK napping, I think is their pet, their at, and they were like, I'm doing UX sessions, so bring your Urbit app to me and talk me through the UX, and they would do it for even wireframes or something. I think that's a way of saying, I have front end expertise that I could bring to bear here, and maybe that person will get some attention from groups that are looking for that kind of design help. I don't know. Does that answer the question?
It does. It does. I mean, I think that that's the reality, right, is that right now the front end people that you'd want to hire, I mean, so Trent's in an interesting position because Trent is also a designer, right? But a lot of times you're going to need, if you're going to hire a front end person, you're going to want them to also have design expertise, because the reality is you're asking something creative of them. So Trent might be looking for someone who can more execute on a spec and fill in those gaps. But like someone for Cordis, you're going to be asking them to also probably design some of the front end in addition to implement it, right? So it's like these headcounts aren't big enough to be like, oh, there's a designer and then there's a front end engineer, right? So I think
that's right.
Is that kind of what you're saying, in addition to some other things?
Yeah, definitely be able to multitask. Another thing, like, we have people who do front end work at Cordis already, and sometimes I'll ship stuff with missing JSON parsing or something, and so they've been able to dive into the Hoon a little bit and add a parser for a specific poke or something like that. These kinds of multidisciplinary skills, or even just attempting to do that, it means a lot about a person. Failing to do it is not so big of a deal. It's the attempting to do it that's important.
I will jump in here just to say, if we would always be willing to entertain a UX developer, is what I'd call it. So someone who has like the ability to design user experiences, but also develop them. That's like this sort of a, two-faceted role that I think is killer. It's like that is this ideal front end unicorn. So people that have those capabilities that are floating around Urbit, reach out to Holly. That's all I'm saying.
And then you could fight with everyone else, because that's, I totally agree, because that's like, especially these small teams. And what I've noticed is that there are idiosyncrasies related to Urbit in terms of its constraints and what it enables, that it is beneficial for a front end person to understand. I mean, it's sort of like, I have seen, and it's funny because that sounds obvious, but we have done thinking in the past where we're like, okay, well, what if we make Urbit more like Firebase, and like a front end developer has to know nothing about Urbit, right? And like that always sounds good, but it's actually very hard to do. So it's really what you want is a developer who's like at the very least architecturally curious. I mean, right? Like, why would you hire someone who doesn't care about Urbit? But you know what I mean? Like someone who's like understands some of these patterns, CQRS, the particular latency, like think about just all the error conditions that could happen on a peer-to-peer network that don't happen in a right? So it's like just that kind of stuff. I think there is that kind of like implicit Urbit knowledge that you do need too.
Yeah, it's the polished developer. Like those error states are like the most critical piece. I mean, I think that's where most projects go to die, are ones that can't get through the burden of proper feedback to the user. So like that's the reason why we were originally intending to put Realm out around assembly, but we just had so many of this sort of like polish around error states and feedback states that we decided to hold off and like really hone that in, because I think it's a hugely important thing. So
absolutely.
One thing I would say is
Ted, why don't you go a little bit on the quick side, then we'll try to do some of these questions before we log off. So.
Sure. I would just say very briefly, I would say what's much more important is somebody who's willing to learn something new, typically, at least for sort of a long-term hire. That willingness is not very well correlated with other things. You may not have any background in programming. You may be coming from a big company. You may be an expert. You may be a novice, but there's an openness there that's really required because you have to absorb a lot of new information. And so if you don't want to do that in your heart of hearts, then you're not going to have a great time. But if that appeals to you, then Urbit is basically like an everlasting treasure trove of new things to learn.
It is. It's like a clown car where the clowns keep getting out of the car, and you're like, wait, there's more things I got to learn. I get to learn.
Sort of,
But I
but
think
and it's not like more things. It's like more dimensions of the system that you can get right, or like because you can read all the code, but then knowing why the code is done that way, and like there's more and more to learn about the history of computing and how we can apply that.
I mean, I said I wasn't going to say anything, but I've hired a few people in the Urbit sphere, and by far, I think your point, Ted, is the strongest for what I look for. Is curiosity, right? And it's almost like it's very rare to find someone who gets this far into Urbit, or at least, especially back in the day, because they had to like drag themselves over glass to get to Urbit, and they'd be interested. They'd have had zeal, and that's the reason why you have the founder of Zorp that Logan that Will mentioned started as a mobile developer, right? And Liam, we hired him to do like JavaScript, and now he's like a core contributor. So it's like you see that a lot because we hired people that just had the curiosity and the drive and the willingness to just that. I mean, and also when you're a small system, you don't have the management overhead to tell everyone what to do all the time. You need people to really want to solve these problems. And so, it sounds, it's like the squishiest thing you can imagine, right? But I'd rather have someone who's curious to learn than someone who has, years and years of, above some competency level, someone who has years and years of expertise, because if they have years and years of expertise, they also have expectations about what that role should and should not have to do, which I think in my experience can verge into being a problem later.
I'm going to call out that the two examples that you bring up there, we can go to the questions in a second, but there's also a capacity element. And there are some people in the Urbit community that are just so hyper capacious that it's like really kind of frustrating sometimes. But you shouldn't be discouraged by the existence of these people who are so profoundly gifted, because even with effort, the middle class of current Urbit users, which I still constitute as like the higher end of the IQ like spectrum, right? But that middle class can still produce valuable commodities on Urbit.
With the right nootropic cocktail available at this link, you can also
Solidulene.
I think though, it's like, of course I agree, but I mean, to me, like things like curiosity, drive, like enthusiasm about the project, like those are things that are accessible to everyone, right? I mean, that's not nootropics or not. Actually, so these questions are relatively straightforward, so we can just go ahead and answer these. But I think there's a couple of questions here based about how to get involved. And if I think we talked about, if you're interested in contributing to one of these projects, reach out to anybody here. If you're interested in general, there we go. Is learning a Hoon a requirement? I think we answered that pretty well. I mean, there's a lot of stuff available both on the front end, and a lot of these roles or a lot of these teams are also hiring, I think, like marketing people. Trent, are you hiring anyone who's like straight up non-technical, or is everybody like a designer or an engineer?
Yeah, so we actually have a developer experience sort of role. So someone who's just focused on documenting and like helping developers build and fleshing out that whole system. I think it'd be good if we had that now. I think Cordis would like to have that guy at Helium. So
good. And I think that this last question is probably the best, right? Which is that I want to make an app, but I need messaging to realize. There we go. So the short answer is we've recently revamped the Urbit Foundation group here. And so that link will be available in the show notes. my lovely assistant will put those down there. And in that group, there are ecosystem reports published by moi every week that goes through all these companies and talks about, what everyone's working on, what their requirements are, upcoming releases, et cetera, and so forth. So I'd say if you're interested, these last two questions, if you're interested in getting more involved with other people building things, I think the Urbit Foundation group and those reports in particular will give you all the leads you need to start talking to people, seeing what people are working on, and so forth. And so I think that that's also important for, a good point is brought up here, which is, a lot of the interoperability of Urbit apps is, of course, a thing that we all talk about a lot. So keeping an eye kind of on what other people are working on is a very important thing. And I think the Urbit Foundation group, we're trying to more and more make that kind of the hub to answer those questions. So we're out of time. I apologize. We can't have any closing thoughts or any song and dance, but I really want to thank all of you guys, all you panelists, and Luke who had to drop off. I think this was really, really insightful. And I wish I had something like this when I was a noob, but hopefully we can pay it forward. So thank you very much. We'll talk to you all later.
Thanks.